The Toronto Comic Arts Festival would like to honor and acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We are in a territory that was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon One Pump Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to share and care for the land. This land is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This acknowledgement is a reminder that we are all treaty people and that we have a responsibility to the land and each other. TCAF celebrates the long history of sharing stories on this land and is committed to increasing Indigenous voices and perspectives in our programming.
Welcome, everyone, to the TCAF 2024 virtual program. My name is Fiona Smith, and I'm this year's general programmer. We are privileged to present Graphic Witness, a conversation with today's comics journalists. And we're looking at some of the most important comics that are being made today. Our moderator is MJ Lyons, or is it Leon?
Lyons, like the English way.
A writer, journalist, and game developer. Over more than a decade, he has covered arts, culture, science, and politics as a journalist based out of Toronto. MJ's second book, Queer Werewolves Destroy Capitalism, was published by Microcosm Press in May 2021 and nominated for the Lambda Literary Awards Best LGBTQ Erotica category. And our esteemed guests are Sarah Glidden, a cartoonist, illustrator, and creator of nonfiction and reportage comics. Sarah's second book, Rolling Blackouts, Dispatches from Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, was published by Drawn Quarterly in 2016. And we're also joined by Graphic Mundi folks, award-winning journalist and novelist Feurat Alani, the creator of The Flavors of Iraq, Impressions of My Vanished Homeland, which releases on May 7th this year, 2024, and founding director of Positive Negatives and a senior fellow at SOAS, University of London, Benjamin Worku-Dix, and freelance illustrator and comics writer Lindsay Pollock are the creators of Vanni, based on firsthand accounts of the Sri Lankan Conflict, which was released in October 2023. And lastly, but not least, award-winning editorial, illustrator, and visual journalist, Olivier Kugler, the creator of Escaping Wars and Waves, Encounters with Syrian Refugees, which was released in November 2023. And let's begin.
First of all, thank you so much to all of you for being here. And also thank you for everybody tuning into our digital panel. Digital programming with TCAF makes it so we have, I think, people from all over the other side of the ocean. Makes it possible for them to join us. So we're just so thrilled to have you all here. I'll just say a couple of quick things, and then we'll get going. I think that this is an especially important thing to cover in terms of comics and depictions of war and conflict. I mean, we live in this time of intense global conflict, and all of us, no matter kind of where you are in the world, can see and hear so much, often in sort of intimate and extremely horrifying detail, and you really, really have to make an effort to escape. And I think probably like one of the most, again, interesting and also like terrifying things about the time that we live in is we are literally kind of watching things like war and genocide happen in real time. But then there's the flip side of that of we see the sort of resistance and the pushback against those also in real time. So it's this weird sort of balance of like solidarity and also just, the worst horrors that we could imagine. But journalists and people who do things like reportage and art journalism bridge the kind of what's happening with the why it's happening and give that all context. And so I think that that's a really important frame for the discussion today. I'd love just to get us started with, I mean, I read through a lot of the work, and the genesis of each project was so different. They all kind of start from different points of all of these sort of conflicts, often overlapping, that we're talking about today. For people not familiar with your work, where did the project start? And if anybody wants to jump in, otherwise I can start doing the teacher thing and pointing at people.
You better point at someone.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, let's actually start with Feurat, because yours is you have a really lovely, speaking of context, you have a really lovely intro to your new project, and it's an especially kind of interesting genesis of what you're talking about.
Thank you very much. Actually, it started very late in my small career. I was based in Baghdad in 2003 to cover the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Being a French with Iraqi descent and speaking Arabic, it was easier for me to get into the situation there. I was just a very young journalist, and I didn't have any clue on how to report. So I just stayed with my family in Baghdad and Fallujah in what in that time we called the red zone. The red zone was basically where the Iraqi were living. I couldn't afford to be in a hotel or to be in a American base and so on. So I covered the war for at least 5-6 years on the field. And when I came back to France, where I live, where I was born, I continued to talk about Iraq, but I've seen that the interest was not as expected, and for me, it was something very difficult to accept. So I thought about other kind of medium or ways to describe what was going on there. And it's very late in 2016, so 13 years later, especially among the storm about the Islamic State and all the explosions and killings everywhere in Iraq and beyond, in Europe and the US and UK. I've noticed that people were talking about Iraq, in my view, in the wrong, only on one side, based on one side, especially on Twitter. We have seen the so-called experts. Most of the time, they've never been in Iraq or in an Arabic country, and they were talking things to me that were really cold, only based on figures, violence, death, and it was not my Iraq. So I started to write a small story on Twitter. The only base I had was my memories, because I used to go to Iraq when I was a kid. So during Saddam Hussein's regime, I went there during the embargo, and then as a journalist to cover the war, the last war. So my idea was to bring a kind of counter narration on what was going on in Iraq by bringing the other side. So it's very important to talk about the death, but I wanted to point how Iraqis used to live as well. So bringing colors, smells, flavors, like daily life, and to show to the French audience first that Iraqis had the same issues, same joy, same pain as everyone. So I started by 10 tweets per day during the summer, and I ended up with 1,000 tweets, which were based from my memories from 89 until 2011, when the US troops officially left Iraq. And so I ended my summer with the long text, and that's how it started.
I just want to, I mean, digging into this was such a joy, just in terms of those tiny details. Just really quickly before we continue, I want to read one that I just especially loved. An Arab welcome at the Baghdad airport where about 100 family members are waiting for us. I'm wearing a blue tie. I go from hug to hug. And just that, that detail of the blue tie, I don't know why it just really gets me, but just really kind of those little details just ground it so well. Yeah, sorry. Anyways,
thank you for that, because I really focused on the details.
Yeah.
It's very important to me. Again, and I will be very brief. when I used to hear the analysis on Twitter or on media in general, it was always like globalizing the issue without going into details. So the blue tie, the smell of the apricot ice cream is very important to me to bring and to show, to tell more and more about the other side of the war.
I'll keep pointing.
I mean, it might make sense for me to go next because of what Feurat was saying. The genesis of Rolling Blackouts was also because the Iraq War was forgotten. But from the American side of things, my project, I followed some friends who are freelance journalists. They were going on a reporting project to look into kind of the legacy of the Iraq War, and we went in late 2010. So right as, you know, the troops were kind of withdrawing. And the idea behind that was that, like, you know, Barack Obama had been elected. Everyone wanted to turn the page. No one was really talking about Iraq anymore because the war was over. But here we had, you know, a couple million refugees and displaced people, massive amounts of destruction, and just a country and regions within that country that needed to continue on, and nobody was talking about it. So their plan was to go there and to report on, you know, mostly refugee and displacement issues, but also about the war on terror in general. And, you know, they were focusing on one guy who was an Iraqi Kurd who had been deported for suspicions of abetting terrorism in the 9/11 attacks. And so, yeah, it was their way and my way of wanting to highlight, you know, we can't turn away from this. This is something that our country did, you know, without really the support of anybody else and with a lot of protest against it. But nobody looks at it anymore. And so, and a big part of that was also looking at the details for me, as, you know, I reported on the reporters. I kind of followed them, took a lot of recordings. So all of the dialogue in the book is from real recordings, but I also took a lot of visual notes, a lot of photos, a lot of drawings, because I wanted to show the details, like Feurat was saying, of what these places look like. I think that we have a tendency as Americans who we don't have a lot of, we don't spend a lot of time looking at other countries until there's something happening that makes us pay attention, like a war. And so I think that what happens is with places like Iraq, we don't have an image, like an imagery of it besides destroyed buildings. And you can see that happening now with Gaza. We see Gaza as a place of destruction, and we don't see a lot of images of what it was before. And so people kind of naturalize that idea, like, this is a war-torn place. This was always a war-torn place, and it's just a place of violence. And you don't see the way people lived there and, you know, their lives. You only see them, you know, as victims, or if you're on the another side of things, you see them as the ones doing the violence. And so I think it's important to see those details and to see the way people live. And, you know, interestingly, we also went to Syria because that's where a large portion of Iraqi refugees fled. And we were in Damascus. And this was, December 2010. So it was, you know, a few months before civil war broke out there. And it was just a beautiful city, like full of life and just full of people going about their daily business, cafes, like, and, you know, it ended up being, for me, very important to show life in Syria as well, because I think that became another place that we didn't look at before the war broke out. So we don't have these images of, this is just a normal place with people with normal lives, with, you know, a lot of generosity, and, you know, people were incredibly welcoming and wonderful to us. So it retroactively became really important for me to show all of those details and to show life in Syria. You know, as we were doing our reporting, the focus was on the refugees who lived there. But in the background, as I was working on this, it was really important to show that place as a real place, you know, in 3 dimensions with all of the life that was contained within it.
Yeah, and so much of the work, it's interesting that so much of the work, I mean, in a way, all of the stories that we're talking about today deal with like displacement, diaspora. So I think that leads especially into our other projects, which both are about like displacement, either internally or externally. Somebody want to jump in?
Yeah, I can talk about the Vanni with I mean the beginnings of that book. I was working for the UN in North Sri Lanka in Vanni, in an area called Vanni, for 4 years, from the day after the tsunami in 2004 up until the final UN evacuation because of the war in September 2008. And in that 4 year period, I was the communications and liaison between the UN and the Tamil Tiger, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Land, the LTTE, which were prescribed as a terrorist organization globally. The pioneers of today's suicide bombing. They pioneered the suicide vest that we now know, and has been ruling that area since the early 1980s, with many protracted wars. And I went through that 4 year experience of living in an incredibly rural, unique part of the world that was governed by an iron fist of this rebel group. And I got to know in that 4 years thousands of civilians who, going back to Sarah's point of humanizing the dehumanized, the work. Whenever I looked at media, of which there wasn't much media coverage of North Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers, purely because they didn't really do any external terrorist attacks. It was always towards the Sri Lankan state. So they famously killed the Indian Prime Minister in the late 90s. But again, it's regional. They didn't do anything in Europe or outside of that much. So but the portrayal of people who lived in the north of Sri Lanka was terrorism, and there was a very blurry distinction between the Tamil and the Tiger. And when I started to get towards the evacuation, towards the end of my time there, I was getting quite frustrated with writing UN reports that I didn't feel had a huge influence on what was happening on the ground. And I was spending a lot of time in our bunker under air attack, and the war was kind of right on us. And I read my first 2 graphic novels, Palestine by Joe Sacco and Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I'd never had any interaction with comics before. I'd read the Beano and some Calvin and Hobbes before as a kid, but that was my first kind of, and I remember it was a real eureka moment of coming out of the bunker one evening after reading these 2 graphic novels and kind of looking at the Tamil Tiger rebels, the Sri Lankan Air Force dropping bombs, 500,000 internally displaced people, us, the UN, who are pretty impotent as ever on the ground, and thinking, there's a graphic novel here. and I came out of Sri Lanka and met Lindsay, who is an old university friend of a friend, and basically put this genocide on his desk and said, do you want to draw this? And what I found with going through the process of turning it into a graphic novel was the ability to be able to humanize people, to be able to tell stories. So the first, whole chapter of our book is life before the war and before the tsunami, of just kind of normal South Asian village life, of collecting fish, of looking after family, of struggling to make ends meet, and humanizing that is exactly the same as anyone else living on this planet. They're not extraordinary people, they're just ordinary people who end up in extraordinary circumstances. And I find that is a big thing through conflict, whether you're Syrian, Iraqi, Sri Lankan, Palestinian, like Jewish, you're ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. And I find media quite often portrays people as extraordinary. And I have a problem with that. And so I find the graphic novel, the comic form, a really quite unique way of being able to shine a lens on the ordinariness of people's lives, and that's exactly what war shatters, and displacement shatters, because then you do become extraordinary circumstances, living abroad, becoming refugees, internally displaced, fighting for reunification of your family, being severed from your home ties, from your people, and comics allow us to kind of transcend those times and spaces and memories and emotions in a really unique way that I haven't really found through documentary or other art forms. It's quite special when you work with such talented artists. So yeah, that's the kind of foundations of the Vanni book.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly jump off from that because, of course, Ben brought this to me and completely changed the course of everything that I was doing. You know, I'd spent about 10 years making documentary films, and 10 years was proving to be enough because although I really enjoyed it, it was extremely sort of punishing, you know, sort of getting funding and finding distribution and all of this. And I turned to illustrating, and you know, with a view to sort of doing children's storybooks and things of this nature. So it was a very sharp sort of left turn when Ben came to me with the project. But it was immediately exciting and interesting. And, you know, as Sarah and Ben have both touched on, you know, sort of like, I think an aspect of what makes comics work so well in a sort of journalistic context is that, you know, they're perfect for depicting memory. You know, this is a really sort of key aspect of them is you know, it's the fact that they're made up of sort of juxtaposed images. And then, you know, once you get to a kind of a book, you've got something where, you know, you have these different moments where you can kind of flick from sort of here to here, and you can see all of these things, whole lives kind of condensed together onto the page. Which means that, you know, they function in a very different way. And they also, you know, unlike with sort of filmed journalism or sort of spoken word or, you know, which is sort of all kind of very immediate, and it's really to do with sort of, you know, here is the news. This is the sort of, you know, comics, you know, by their nature, they take a while to produce, and so you're forced to sort of think about things and address things in a different, more reflective kind of way. And so, you know, nobody's going to be turning to comics to kind of get the latest about what's going on, but you will turn to a piece of comic journalism to sort of get a really sort of considered kind of personal kind of reflection on things. And so, you know, I was a little bit hesitant for a very brief moment, but then, you know, once I started, you know, hearing everything that sort of Ben had to tell me, you know, I got hooked in, assured him that, you know, yeah, I was into it, and, you know, it would be the work of a couple of years, and then something like 9 years later, our book was finished. So, but yeah, so that was how I got into it.
Yeah, and Olivier, your work is especially interesting because it deals not only with conflicts sort of like as they're unfolding, but really the aftermath of a conflict, of the kind of like the very externally displaced refugee stories.
Yeah, I'm a reportage illustrator. I love to draw people I meet and places I visit. In 2012, I worked on a larger series of drawings documenting the daily life of a French veterinarian who's working with elephants in the logging industry in Laos. And I spent 2 weeks with this guy, kind of, yeah, basically photographing him and interviewing him and the people he meets on his trips into these remote logging camps. And I spent almost a year working on 30 pages documenting the work of the elephant doctor. And these drawings were published in a French magazine called 21. It's a reportage magazine. And there's a Swiss comic book publisher. They're called Edition Moderne, and they saw the drawings I did about the elephant doctor in the French magazine. And they asked if they could publish these drawings in a small book in German. And so this book was published in 2012. And then the publisher told me that there's a big comic book festival in Switzerland. It's called the Fumetto Festival. And one of the festival's partners is Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, the medical charity. And he told me that every year they invite a comic book artist and a comic book author to go out into the field and document one of the projects they're working on. And he asked me if I would be interested in working on such a commission. So I obviously told him I would love to do that. So he forwarded me my contact details, and then I got an email from Doctors Without Borders, and they asked me if I would like to go to Syria, not to Syria, but to Iraqi Kurdistan. Great drawings documenting the circumstances of Syrian refugees living in this camp. And this was they contacted me in the autumn of 2013. So the war in Syria, I think, was already going on for 2.5 years. And so they first thought they would want me to document the work that Doctors Without Borders are doing. But then they had second thoughts because they had difficulties before to get this work published in magazines and newspapers, because the magazines and the newspapers didn't really want to advertise the work that Doctors Without Borders are doing. So they asked me if I would just like to meet refugees in the camp, talk with them, interview them, take photos, and then create drawings documenting their situation. So I went to the camp. It was December 2013, and I spent the first week of the month there, just walking around the camp. Had a local translator, conducted maybe 20, 30 interviews with the people I met. And then it was obviously, before I went, I've never been in a refugee camp before, and I'm not really a journalist. I'm not really familiar with kind of these kind of places. So I listened a lot to radio interviews. I read a lot about the circumstances of refugees. But then when you get there, it was the middle of the winter, it was snowing, it was raining. You walk. I just became a father half a year before, so you walk through the mud. You walk past tents, and you hear babies crying, and then you see little boys or little girls walking basically bare feet through the mud to the Dixie toilets that are outside of the tents, and it's kind of, and you speak with people whose houses have been destroyed, who lost family members in the war, who got husbands vanished in military prisons and never came back. So it hits you on a whole different level when you kind of meet these people. You hear these stories all the time when you listen to the radio or follow the news, but I found this a really how do you say it, horizon widening experience. Yeah, so when I came back from the camp, I worked for maybe 2 or 3 months on a small series of drawings that were exhibited during a work in progress exhibition at the Fumetto Festival, but they were also published in magazines and newspapers in Europe mainly, but also a small series of drawings were published in Harper's Magazine in the US. And back then I started to think it was just a commission to create a small body of work, but I thought I would love to create a whole book about the people I met in the camp. But I didn't have the funding, so I wrote an Arts Council grant application here in England and spent almost 3 or 4 months just applying for a grant, but I didn't get it in the end. So I stopped working on this project because I had to make money. I had to take on commercial commissions. And then, but a year later, I got an email from one of the people working for the Association of Illustrators here in London, and she told me that the drawings that were published in Harper's Magazine were awarded with the World Illustration Award. And I was really excited about that. Obviously, I contacted Doctors Without Borders in Switzerland, and they got back to me the next day, and they asked me if I would like to go to Kos Island in Greece. This was in the summer of 2015. If I would like to create more drawings documenting the circumstances of Syrians arriving on the island. And then I went down there, I did more drawings. They were also published in Harper's Magazine again. And then I finally got a grant that allowed me to also do similar work based on Syrians in Calais, in the migrant camp in Calais, but also in England and in Germany as well. So that's the way how I got into this project.
Yeah, the way that each of these projects come together into the final product, the final book. So we have like the fictionalized but real life accounts in Vanni. We have sort of like direct interviewing in Rolling Blackouts and Escaping Wars and Waves. I mean, the direct kind of biographical perspective of the flavors in Iraq. And they all kind of offer different entries into the stories told. And these days, like memoir, biography, and autofiction are kind of staples of graphic novels. But reportage illustration or graphic journalism or art journalism, it definitely feels like they approach these topics and like the medium in a different way. Like, yeah, how would you say that? How would you say that, especially for those of you who are fans of those kinds of like memoir graphic novels, how would you say that your work approaches what you're looking at?
If I may, sorry.
Please.
No, it's a very interesting question. First of all, because especially in France, I don't know if it's the same in the US or in UK or in another place, but in the reportage kind of field, it's very not common to be subjective. Of course, we have to do the job, go and bring the facts, but we all know that we cannot be really objective. When we go there, we have our story, we have our vision of things. Even if you are really professional and respect the neutrality and the facts, you have an opinion or a view. To me, the graphic novel allows me to have more space and to have more a kind of authorization to not to put myself in, but to bring a subjective view about the thing that we cannot report when we work for print newspapers or TV or radio. And it was always kind of frustrating for me to go to Gaza, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and to get a lot of stories around the reportage and to not being allowed to bring it into something. And that word "something" is very special to me, because when I wrote those tweets at the end of the summer 2016, a colleague of mine told me, we have to do something but what you just wrote. And this something that I didn't know was the graphic novel and an animated documentary, and bringing something new to this story by because of course you cannot film your memory. You cannot go back into time and film it. So we decided to do something with an illustrator called Leonard Cohen in France, and this kind of dialogue between my experience and someone, Leonard, who has never been to Iraq, created something, a good balance to bring something else in a more subjective way with more space. And I have to be really honest, and maybe naive, but I was already questioning myself about the impact of my work. I'm talking about TV, radio, and print. And using this kind of medium, I've noticed that it allows me to reach a wider audience, young people, elders, all kind of people who were not really especially interested about Iraq. But most of the time they came back to me and said, the illustration is amazing, the story is great. Thank you, because I didn't know what was Iraq, and now I want to read more about Iraq or Gaza or Libya or Afghanistan. And to answer direct to your question, the kind of trend of biography or autofiction, to me, answers to a necessity that we have to question ourselves as reporters. Do we have impact? Do we still have impact on the global issues and opinion. And I can say on my side, because I've been together, maybe you all been there, but last time I've been there was in 2014. And when I tried to go there, we couldn't. We wrote a letter with hundreds of journalists. It didn't work. We had an amazing work on the ground by Palestinian journalists, but did it change something? You know, and I'm still questioning myself, and I feel I'm a very optimistic person, but I think we have to question ourselves on how to bring this news and how to try to change the narrative and to change the mindset of people. Maybe graphic novels allows us to have more space and to be more creative.
Lindsay, I believe you had something. Lindsay and Kat, because it wouldn't be a Zoom call without a cat jumping up.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I was going to put her out, but she's just clever enough to get just out of my reach now. So stay there, Kat. Yeah, no, I mean that's all really interesting. I sort of you know, in the whole kind of this thing of sort of reportage comics and sort of, you know, the kind of the approach that we took. So I was looking back in preparation for this conversation. I was looking back at the sort of all of the stages of work that Ben and I went through, and all of the different kinds of incarnations of how we were conceiving writing this book, Vanni, and we sort of there were incarnations of it which were being told in, you know, directly in the words of the characters, and where we were sort of more or less lifting verbatim the sort of the things that had been told to us by people that we had spoken to. And then there were other versions where, you know, we ultimately ended up with sort of a third person narration that kind of foregrounds the sort of it foregrounds the fact that it is a sort of a fictionalized kind of telling, and it also foregrounds the sort of the subjectivity, and that's where we ended up. But there is this sort of spectrum of possibilities. I think that something that we were concerned with was, you know, our identity as, you know, white men from the West coming in to tell this story. That sort of came out of the sort of the circumstances in which the whole book was conceived in the first place. So, you know, Ben, as he said, had been working for the UN, and he was the one who had the impetus that he wanted to do something to draw attention to the war, because the war specifically was one which had been largely ignored by the Western media, and also had been deliberately concealed by the Sri Lankan government, who expelled the UN, but certainly also expelled international journalists and tried to make sure that the eyes of the world couldn't see what was going on there. And so in that context, and given that nobody else was sort of really talking about it, certainly not in this way, we sort of said, well, yeah, we have the ability to do this. So despite who we are, we will go in and we will do our best to try to be a conduit, a channel for these people's stories. But we will also foreground, and indeed in the book itself, there's a scene at the end where me and Ben finally kind of walk in on our characters and do an initial kind of meeting and interview with them, just to kind of really show the reader the process that we went through, the fact that we are the ones who ultimately decided how to render this story, but also that it all starts with actual real people. So we wanted to sort of make that really clear, that the sort of the true initiation of this whole thing is reality. And so, you know, sort of looking at that, you know, these kinds of issues can get quite sort of kind of complicated when you start thinking about them. Sort of, you know, the different people who are involved in the creation of a book like this, and it is a kind of, ultimately, it's a kind of collaborative effort between us and all of the people that we talked to, and all of those people who contributed sort of reporting that we drew on. And as the book was progressing, as I was drawing it, Ben began this organization, Positive Negatives, which is designed, initially it was specifically doing further comic strips, but it's branched out in all kinds of wonderful ways into sort of animation and other forms now. But looked at applying this model of comic strip reportage to other human rights issues around the world. And as that organization has grown and become established, they now, Ben, you can correct me, but I'm pretty sure that in almost all circumstances, if it's possible, it's always someone who's from the country in question or has some kind of personal relationship to the issue in question who does the telling. Which, you know, is the sort of the ideal, I think. But because of where we started and who we were, that was the approach that we took, was to foreground ourselves within, you know, in the body of the book. But the content, the sort of you know, the sort of everything that's depicted, I don't think that there's anything in there which was imagined. All of it was a collage made up of real incidents and things as reported to us. So yeah, that was our approach with Vanni.
Yeah, if I may, like on the subject of like subjectivity, like I think it's really important, and I do think that that's something that comics do really well. And you know, this last book of mine was about the process of making journalism, so it did have a lot of the characters, the journalists, discussing what goes into making journalism. And the fact that I'm a character in it, and this, for most of my work, I do this, I think it's really important to foreground the people who are making the object, the work, because, you know, really there is no such thing as objectivity in journalism. There's always going to be this kind of like collective context that the organization is coming from, that the reporter is coming from, that the nation that they're grew up in is coming from. And you see
the publisher too, like
the publisher, everything. There's always biases, and we see this now. You know, again, talking about Gaza, it's hard to know what news source to trust. And I was very naive, you know, when I was going into this project. You know, we started kind of talking about it in 2009. I was very much like, I read my New York Times, you know, I would listen to my Democracy Now! Too, like maybe a little more trustworthy, but, you know, learning more about journalism, you learn about all of the biases that go into these things. And, you know, now I go into reading any article from any source with kind of like, well, where are they coming from? Who did they not talk to? How did they choose who they spoke to? What representative of this government is giving this information? Like, that is all stuff we have to think about. And I think that when it comes to comics, and, you know, Palestine by Joe Sacco was also one of my first introductions to comics. And I appreciated that he was there in it. So you're always reminded that he's the one observing these things and talking to these people. And, you know, he's even the one drawing it. And so you're not fooled into thinking this is objective. You always know he made this, he was there. And I think that's important. I like knowing that in a way, I trust it more than the, you know, objective journalist, because it's flat out on the table. He's already showing you, and that makes it more trustworthy to me. And, you know, I see this now when you have, you know, these young reporters in Gaza showing these TikTok videos of their lives there. You know, that has been so impactful for millions of people all over the world, that they're speaking in English to the world and showing their lives. Like, you can't, I mean, people still do think that they're liars somehow, but forget those people. You know, you can actually see their lives. And that is something that, you know, the New York Times can't do, especially since there aren't even any journalists allowed there. But yeah, I think that that's something that comics does well, when it shows the transparency, it shows how this stuff is made. And there's no kind of lying about objectivity there.
Yeah, I think what Feurat said earlier, a word that really stuck out to me was authorization, which is interesting because, like, speaking about your work, because it has author right there, right there in it, and like that's literally kind of the frame. And again, jumping back to Vanni, you talk about the kind of epilogue scene that has Lindsay and Ben in it, but just the intro scene as well, where it shows one of the characters who you're about to see, you know, the intimate and gory details of their life, sitting in a cab, and somebody says, "Oh, Sri Lanka, there was a war there, wasn't it?" And it's like, oh my God, scourging, right? Like just brutal. Um, does anybody else have anything they wanted to add? Because I mean, again, I'm being conscious of time, and I still have a couple things that I want to jump on, but
Yeah, if I got a
sure,
minute.
please.
Yeah. It's interesting, Sarah, that you mentioned that you draw yourself into your stories, and Joe Sacco does the same. I love Joe Sacco's work. I was doing my master's in illustration in New York, and when I saw Joe Sacco's work the first time, and it absolutely blew my mind. Back then, I didn't really even know that there's something like reportage comic books or reportage illustration. The thing is, I never really draw myself in my drawings. I come from a tradition of just drawing what I see. I learned to draw on location, and that's still my approach when I draw, for example, the refugees in the camp, and I just wanted to be also very honest. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a historian. I don't really. I've got a very average knowledge of the situation in the Middle East or of the Syrian war. But I was basically thrown into the cold water or into the deep end, and I see myself. I wanted to do this work because I wanted to help raise awareness of the situation of the people I met in the camp, and I wanted to be obviously be very honest and also provide a platform for the people to present themselves to a larger audience, to people who read magazines and newspapers all over the world. And I had a really nice experience. I told you these drawings were published in Harper's Magazine in the US, and one day I got an email from a librarian somewhere, I don't know, Nebraska or somewhere in the middle of I don't want to say the middle of nowhere, but
We call it the Midwest. The Midwest.
And he said he's seen these drawings in Harper's Magazine, and really he would like to show them to the people coming to his small local library. So he asked if you can print them out and make posters of them. And I was really happy about that, because I think if more people, especially in America, and still the most powerful nation in the world, know more about the countries they're bombing or to which they supply bombs with, they might help change politics. It's maybe a naive view, but I think it helps to
Well,
raise.
and if I may, like, you know, you say, yes, you're not included in the drawings, but your work is so artistic, like it's undoubtable that a human being drew this, you know, like it's very artistic. Like you're not just, you don't look like you're just copying a photograph or anything. It's very clearly there's artistic intent and like layering that you're doing, and the way you use color. It's so obvious that this is a human being seeing this person and being there, and relating it in the drawing. And I think that is also a form of showing, you know, your eye and your subjectivity there.
Well, and again, like the way we talk about the little details, and in Olivier's work, the way that the literal text, like the text that accompanies it, which is mostly conversational, but then you have it's sort of like the eye jumping back and forth across the image in the way that anyone would, and be like, you know, here's like a DJ set for weddings, and here's the couch, and like again, you may not be in it, but you offer the kind of frame just as a human being who's there.
Even the handwriting, you know,
Yeah.
it's not just like computer type. And I think that like it really adds something, and people are drawn to that in a way. We see photographs every day, all day. And now we can't even know if they're real or not. But when you see a drawing, you stop and you want to look at it. And yeah, I would love to see those in my library. Like, I think people would love to stop and look at them for a long time.
That's
Yeah.
something I really liked about Lindsay's work with Vanni is he draws animals in the villages, in the spaces, and it's something I was actually struck when I went back to look at Joe Sacco's work. He doesn't draw animals.
Mm.
I was always like, when I started to look at Lindsay's work, I was like, there's always a stray dog, or there's a chicken, or there's a goat, or there's a bird in the sky, or there's something. And Lindsay's great at kind of, there'll be this intense scene going on, and there'll be a goat chewing some leaves off a bush over there, who's completely, removed from this intensity, this emotional scene, and the goat just chews the bush, which is what goats do. And it's like, again, it just kind of like really gives you a glimpse into the ordinariness of it all.
This is the subjectivity of what people notice, though, right? And the kind of artistic choices that Joe Sacco makes. Because I mean, I absolutely love Joe Sacco's drawing. His sort of his technical accomplishments is second to none, and artistically. I mean, maybe this is just a sort of a predisposition of our respective personalities, but I think that there's a real kind of darkness to Joe Sacco's work. Not absolutely always. Sometimes there's a little bit of warmth just to sort of leaven the thing. But his kind of vistas that he does so incredibly well are so bleak. In all of their kind of sort of black and white glory. And for me, the sort of the thing of animals is not, it might well be that he's sort of decided to excise that. It might be that when he's looking at that scene, he doesn't notice them in the way that we do. For me, that thing of sort of the animals is just, that's just my predisposition, that I notice animals because I notice animals, because I'm very preoccupied with animals. and so their kind of presence in in the space of a human tragedy is sort of interesting to me. But every one of us, presented with the same scene would draw it differently, and I just think that is so interesting. It's sort of people. If we all had a camera, there might be sort of a couple of feet of difference in the perspective that we take our shot from. But, with the drawing, it really is sort of channeling the different kind of ways that we all see and what we see in a given scene. So that's an interesting thing with comics.
Wanted to jump on, and maybe Ben, you can get this conversation started, because you kind of speak to this in the sort of I guess the epilogue to the epilogue, the sort of the editorial kind of stuff at the back of Vanni. All of you engaged directly with these conflicts in very different ways for each of the projects, but you engaged directly with the conflicts and the people affected by them. And like I said at the beginning, these days, all of us can witness conflicts, wars, genocides in real time, whether that's abroad or in our own backyards. Again, I'm thinking here in Canada, Turtle Island, Indigenous land defenders who literally live stream ongoing colonial violence at the hands of law enforcement. And again, it's hard to for those of us who care, it's impossible to look away, but it's hard to ignore it in general. You really have to make an effort. So Ben, maybe you can get us started, because you speak to this. How do you stay sane as a person who cares in all of this?
Well, nowadays I've got two young kids, under 3, so that gives me a huge, very present local focus. That I guess 3 years ago my vision was a bit more international, and now my vision is refereeing who's just smashed up the kitchen for the 3rd time this afternoon. But I mean, after Sri Lanka, I went through a very dark period, which is where this book's made. I lost 32 of my colleagues in the Sri Lankan conflict, and I had a real issue with my own space in the world. That we all worked together for 4 years through the hardest of times, and it was the white UN worker that got evacuated out in a flat jacket and bulletproof car, and my Tamil colleagues perished behind me, and that took, well, I mean, that you'll never get over that, and now it's kind of scar tissue, but it was many years of dealing with PTSD and that extreme experience of loss and trauma. And that was very much the foundations of the Vanni book and positive negatives and what I decided to do with my life thereafter of not continuing with a career in the UN. I kind of lost faith in that whole process. And then I went through 7-8 years of building positive negatives, which was many of them are equally as tragic stories of modern day slavery, of the Syrian conflict, of migration. It was pretty dark, and it was quite difficult. I don't know if I did stay sane. Like, I had some dark times, and I guess the thing that pulls you out of that, like I said, is kind of immediate family. Really, you're not that your perspective slightly change, and you remove yourself a little bit, and you have to remove yourself because now I have different responsibilities. And I think actually I do the job better now because I've handed over a lot of the responsibilities now to, as Lindsay alluded, in positive negatives now on a project. If we were to do the Vanni book again, or a project on Sri Lanka, which I've actually just finished a project on Sri Lanka, I work with Sri Lankan researchers, Sri Lankan script writers, and Sri Lankan artists. And so I direct the organization, but I'm actually kind of removed. I'm no longer flying to the space, pretending to be an expert on that topic, and then coming back and doing the project with international artists. I'm very much now engaged with working with local artists, script writers, researchers, and I'll direct the organization. And that kind of distance and removal from the scene allows me, I think, a better, certainly more healthier perspective on it all. Yeah.
Anybody else want to speak to staying sane?
Yeah, if I may, I'm on the same line. To me, it's impossible not to feel something when you go on the ground. And I'm saying this because when I was going to Iraq in 2003, I asked many older colleagues for some advice, how to deal with this. And I was, to be honest, again, a bit disappointed with the answer, because the answer basically was, you have to get a filter between yourself and what you see. The filter could be the camera, it could be your pen. And I couldn't stand talking to these people, witnessing those things with a kind of filter. And I just realized there it was too late. I couldn't filter this. So I had to deal with PTSD, certainly. And also, I think we all agree, when you go in a difficult place, you always compare your life to the lives of the people you film or you describe. And then you get this imposter syndrome, I think we say in English, that you are not in your place. You are not supposed to be where you live, especially for me as a French Iraqi. I know I'm lucky. I know I'm lucky to have been born in France, to having grown up in France, to have been educated in France. And when I go to Iraq and I see people of my age, I always remind that it could have been me on the other side, and how would have my life be in that situation. So the thing, in my experience, is to use those feelings as a strength, as something to build with, especially into comic novel or graphic novel, when you have the space and the freedom to express yourself. I used that anger sometimes, that horror, that sadness to express things. And I think it's also a way to get rid of all the bad emotions and the negativity when you come back to a peaceful country. When I used to spend, like, for example, 1 year in a row in Baghdad, witnessing the violence, coming back to Paris was a kind of nightmare to me. Seeing all the people living normally, you feel also a kind of injustice. And how do you deal with this? It depends. To me, I used to go run and write. for other people, it's maybe more negative things to forget. You have to deal with it. So if you don't use that feeling, I think it's a waste. It's a waste of time. It's a waste in your creativity to bring those lives that you just witnessed.
I think that's so well put, and I agree. Like it, for me coming back from that trip was, yeah, it was shocking to see everything so normal, and you just feel like so guilty that I'm able to just leave. All these people can't leave; they're stuck here, and I just get on a plane and go because of my passport and because I have the money to do that. But yeah, wallowing in that guilt doesn't help anybody, and you do have to use those feelings and that energy to make something out of it. But it is hard to like creating that distance when you're actually talking to people who are in really horrible conditions. You just want to cry, and you have to find a way to be strong for the person that you're talking to, because it would be really disrespectful, I think, to like come and take their story and then focus on your own feelings about it. And this is what, my friend who was a journalist with much more experience than me, when I asked her about that, it's like, what do you do with your feelings? And she said, you have to keep them back, and you can process that later at the hotel, and you can cry later when you're not with them anymore. But like, you cannot let that go when you're talking to someone. You have to do your job, and you have to be there to listen to them. And I think it's very difficult, but it's so true. You have to, save your feelings for later. And then, yeah, I think, that is a process, and you have to talk to other people about it, and yeah, put that energy into the work. But it's something that you do have to like put a wall up in the moment. But remember that feeling of injustice and unfairness, and bring that and let that be a fire that pushes you.
And I totally agree with Ben when he talking about his family. When you become a dad or a mother, or when you have a family, and when you go to a place like, for example, Gaza, when I went there in 2014, my son was 3 months when I went there just after the ceasefire. And I met with the father who lost 3 kids in one night. So how do you deal with it? As you said, Sarah, you cannot complain. You cannot say anything about your life. You have to how can I put this? Like, you have to accept this tragedy, because you have to do your job, and you have to record it and to bring it to your place and to your media or to your audience. But when you come back, you have this in mind. When you come back to your son or your daughter and your baby, and you compare, because you have to compare. We are humans. I think it's Ben also who talked about humanization. And when you put yourself in the work, especially in graphic novel, when it's helpful, it's very, very, very good to do it, because you show that you're not a robot. You are a human being, and you cannot bring information without feelings. And this comes with comparing your life to the others. Otherwise, how can you give an honest view about this? I cannot imagine another way to work.
Yeah, I mean, it's the makeup of the world. Like, we have to reconcile the fact that we are lucky enough to be sort of like humans with these normal lives and families, and then also in the world there's these people who are literally losing their families. And again, sort of in real time, we see that. Like, you have to kind of reconcile the fact that those two things can exist and try to do something to change it. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to add before we start wrapping things up?
Yeah, you asked us what keeps us sane.
Yeah.
What helped me a lot is just getting stuck in the work, just doing the best possible. I think this was the most intense project I worked on the Escaping Wars and Waves project. And I just worked for almost 3 years nonstop on it, and I put in all my efforts to make this as good as possible, and to help provide the people I met a platform. And that has helped me.
I mean, it's good to actually be doing something. I mean, in some ways, the harder thing is to just be sitting there and sort of reading these comics in and sort of feeling completely kind of helpless and whatever else, in that same way that you feel dreadful when you listen to the news because you can't step through the radio and do something about it, in the process of making these things, at least you are taking something terrible, taking these experiences and trying to turn it into something which is actually useful in the world. So, I mean, I think just sort of, the fact that it's a creative kind of process in a way is its own kind of lifeline of sanity. You just kind of stick to the thought that, okay, let's take something dreadful and see if we can turn it into something which is going to help. So there is that, at least.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because it's something that I wrestle with. When you're making work that is about very, very sad stories, but that you think it's important, it's been really hard for me to know how to publicize the work, especially books. It's like, you don't want to feel like you're profiting off of these people's terrible stories. So it's like, I don't want to oh, look at my book, it's about refugees, you should really go buy it. It's like, I want to share those stories, but I feel very uncomfortable being the one saying like, hey, look at me, you don't want to center yourself. So it's like
collecting kind of plaudits for it, even, sort of,
yeah,
this is a wonderful book, so
look what happened. Like, I got a good review on my book, which is about some horrible things that happened to actual people. Like, it's a very weird position doing nonfiction comics.
Yeah.
But
I always
Very
find it
important.
giving someone a copy of our book and kind of like apologizing that this is going to wreck your week. Our book.
I can confirm that as somebody who has read the book very recently. That
Yeah. So sorry about that.
It'll definitely kind of diverge your day a little bit.
Yeah, maybe don't put this next to your bed on your bedside reading. I have a night thing because it's all of our work now is done through positive negatives. I can remove myself from it. So that's how I sidestep that, because it is awkward and it's difficult to kind of like self-promote this kind of work. But at the same time, I found with the Vanni, like I found it I poured a lot of my own funds into, I came out of Sri Lanka off the back of 4 years with the UN, and the UN's quite well paid. So I had this money, and I was kind of like, actually, I poured quite a lot of that into the project because I felt uncomfortable of this. Nowadays, like, we have to, if we want to be telling these stories, we also have to earn, right? Like I think that kind of traditional thing of the impoverished artist isn't going to get you anywhere, because you're not going to be able to make this work, and if this work's important, you need to be able to make it for people to read it. So I'm less uncomfortable now with I mean, none of us are making big bucks off comics. We're kind of pretty close to the wire, I'm pretty sure. So it's okay,
I just want to highlight something.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. What Sarah said to me is maybe the most important thing we have to ask ourselves, or this is what I ask myself every day as a reporter, is again about what I mentioned in the beginning, is the impact. Especially when you talk to the people they give to us. What do we bring to them? Of course, we sign, so there is a kind of a pride of showing this work, and there's nothing wrong with it to me. But what if it's not helpful? What if the impact is zero? This is where I think we have, in general, to ask ourselves, or we have to do our autocriticism. Why do our reports don't change anything, or very few? It's maybe naive, but when I started 15 years ago, I wanted to change things in Iraq and anywhere else. I dreamt of the Watergate, of any president submitting his resignation and on something important. Never happened, of course, but still today, what is the impact and what is the definition of impact today with Instagram, X, and all those things? When you see in Gaza that people are doing the job, they do the job. We are witnessing everything. There's nothing is hidden. But what impact do we have? And I think this is a kind of debate we have to get the courage to dive into. It's very important in my view.
Yeah, lovely. Does anybody else have anything they want to add?
I would only say on that sort of, you know, I think that you will probably never know specifically or directly or very rarely will you kind of get a sense of a direct impact that your work has made. And I think that you know, that feeling of that slight feeling of futility that I guess everybody has had at one time and another, because of course, you know, you do your work about these things, but it doesn't, you know, affect an instant or comprehensive kind of change in any way. But I think that you have to sort of look at work like this as being part of the great cultural collage that, you know, the sort of the whole thing kind of set, you know, people absorb this stuff and it kind of sets the tone for how people conceive of, you know, the specific war or conflict or subject that you're talking about, or conceive of these things in general. And so, you know, you know, I'm always thinking about sort of refugees and migrants and how they're seen, because of how appallingly they're portrayed in mainstream media. And so to me, all of the kind of work that we're doing, just it goes into the general kind of cultural stew, and it means that at least there's this kind of countervailing narrative is also in there. And I think that's about as good as it gets.
Yeah.
I think that's as much as you can really hope for, is just that, you know, that there's always going to be 1,000 competing voices, and so you get in there and you add your voice. But you know, it's never going to be much more than that, except in, you know, sort of vanishingly rare occasions where maybe it gets kind of picked up and used as a sort of a specific kind of catalyst. One thing with the work that we've done with Positive Negatives, and the Positive Negatives does in particular, is that all of those projects are designed with education and educational materials in mind. And that's a great thing with comics, is that they are absolutely tailor-made for education.
Accessibility.
Accessibility, absolutely. And that's the golden thing.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
I was going to say with that, like we now all about, I mean, we've done, I don't know, 90 odd projects now, and we're now working with educational consultants to kind of develop educational resources around all of this work, and goes into schools, and it's proving incredibly popular, because, you know, I mean, school kids get to read comics and watch animations, and then there's all this kind of material. Okay, let's discuss migration, internal displacement, the UN human rights charters, all of this stuff, and it keeps coming back to the narratives of the comics, and it's all kind of synced in. And it's we're doing that in about 3-4 countries at the moment, and kind of expanding. And it's a wonderful way to kind of teach the next generation about these very complex issues through comics, but also through narratives, through storytelling. So I kind of look at the actual projects now as kind of the engagement, and then the impact is the educational work. So that has, yeah, long-term impact, I hope.
Very cool.
I think it's a good place to take a deep breath, and I'd like to thank you all for being here and sharing your perspective. Like, I mean, again, absolutely incredible works across the board. I think that we can definitely acknowledge that that they are impactful. And yeah, once again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you on behalf of TCAF 2024, to MJ for moderating, and to our guest, Olivier,
Well done.
for Lindsay, Ben, and Sarah, for your work, your insight, and your care. And thank you to our production manager, Jalen Innes. Special thanks to our programming sponsors, Seneca College School of Creative Arts and Animation, and special thanks to our presenting sponsor, Toronto Public Library. TCAF would also not be possible without the support from the Canada Council of the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, Toronto Arts Council, and the Government of Ontario. And just finally, a couple of notes. Please mark your calendars. The fest is over the weekend of May 11th and 12th. But on Friday, May 10th, we have the Word Balloon Academy, which is programmed by our very own MJ. Additionally, our digital marketplace commences on May 3rd and concludes on May 24th. Explore the exciting lineup of creators and events on our official website, TorontoComics.com, and stay informed with timely updates on our Instagram handle at TorontoComics. And missed any part of the action? Fear not, as all our digital programs are available for retrospective viewing on our YouTube channel, Toronto Comics, and immerse yourself in the wonderful digital programs to come. See you at TCAF 2024.